Hey everyone, welcome back to Try Not to Sleep. I'm your host, Ethan Brooks, and as always, we're here with another calm, slightly boring story from history to help you unwind. Tonight, we'll be digging into the curious case of why, according to ancient Sumerian tablets, humans were made to forget everything from their past lives before they were born. All right. Get comfortable. And let's see how far you make it before you fall asleep. Here's the thing. Sumerian myths don't just tell stories. They give instructions. Take the Enki and Nimma text. It doesn't just say humans were made from clay. It specifies the source. Clay from the Abzu, a realm sealed off from mortals and gods alike. Not just any mud. This is the foundation of the gods' own domain. Mainstream scholars say it's all metaphor. Clay is just a symbol for the earth, and the Abzu is a fancy way to say underground water. So the myth is about humans emerging from the land. Nothing more. Except the text goes out of its way to emphasize the inaccessibility of this clay. Why stress that it comes from a hidden, divine reservoir? Why not just say dirt from the riverbank? That's the anomaly. Now, some researchers have suggested an alternative. Maybe this isn't just a poetic flourish. Maybe it's a coded reference to a lost process, a literal recipe for creating life, one that's now out of reach. It sounds wild, but here's a fact. The first major dig at Nippur in 1889 uncovered tablets that mix administrative records with these creation stories. The same scribes who invented accounting also wrote about divine recipes. So, what's going on? Are these ancient texts just creative storytelling, or is there a hidden technical layer? Reality check. The strongest objection is that there's zero physical evidence for any life-making technology in Sumer. That's fair. No lab equipment, no blueprints, just clay tablets and myth. But the specificity of the Abzu clay and its repeated mention as sealed and divine raises the question. Why invent such a detail if it's just symbolic? And here's the kicker. The Sumerians list over 100 divine ordinances, including things like truth, fear, and craftsmanship. But knowledge of origins, nowhere to be found. So was this omission just a coincidence, or a deliberate act to keep the real recipe hidden? And if so, who decided what knowledge was too dangerous to record? But here's the twist. If the Sumerians had a secret recipe, why hide it at all? Enki, the god of wisdom and water, is always the wild card in these stories. He's the one who bends the rules, slips forbidden knowledge to humans, and outsmarts the other god. But when it comes to the origin of humanity, suddenly Enki goes silent. That's weird. The texts describe him shaping humans from Abzu clay, but they never spell out how. He intervenes, but the method is left blank, like a recipe with the key ingredient blacked out. Mainstream scholars say this is just the nature of myth. Divine secrets are always half told, because the point isn't the mechanics, it is the message. Except the Sumerians were obsessed with lists and instruction. They catalogued everything. King lists, me, even the dimensions of temple. Why go vague on the one thing that defines humanity? So maybe the omission isn't accidental. Some researchers propose that the knowledge was deliberately withheld, not just from the story, but from the entire canon. The idea, access to the forbidden dough, was a privilege for gods Or maybe a priestly elite. Now let's anchor this. The Weld-Blundell prism, catalogued as WB 444 and dated to around 1800 BCE, contains the Sumerian king list. It records impossible reigns before the flood, then abruptly switches to normal lifespan. That's a hard line, almost like a firewall. So what happened at the flood? Did the gods lock humanity out of their own origin story? Reality check. Critics argue there's no evidence of a cover-up, just myth evolving with politics and power. But if that's true, why the sudden shift in how knowledge gets recorded after the flood? Why the obsession with what's left unsaid? And here's the thing. If the forbidden dough was hidden for a reason, what else did the Sumerians know? And what did they fear would happen if it got out? Hold that thought. If the Sumerians locked away the secret of our origins, where did they hide it? And did anyone ever try to dig it up? Here's where things get interesting. The first major excavation at Nippur started in 1889, about 160 kilometers from what would become Baghdad. Archaeologists expected temple ruins and royal records. What they found instead was a labyrinth of tablets, thousands of them, buried deep in the subsoil. But it wasn't just administrative paperwork. Mixed in were hymns, king lists, and strange mythic recipes. Some tablets described rituals for summoning gods. Others hinted at forbidden knowledge, always just out of reach. So, why Nippur? Mainstream historians say it was simply the religious capital, the logical place for a scribal archive. Makes sense. Except the sheer density and depth of the tablet layers suggest something else. Some texts were deliberately buried, sealed away beneath newer construction. That's not normal record keeping. Then there's the clay itself. Some tablets were made from local river mud, but a few, especially those with cosmological texts, used a finer, almost imported clay. Was this a symbolic gesture, or did it mean something more? Now watch what happens next. In the Enki myths, the Abzu is always described as both a source of life and a sealed vault. The Sumerians built their temples, ziggurats, right above these subterranean waters. Coincidence? Or were they literally marking the spot? Here's a fact. The British Museum's flood tablet, K3375, dug up by Hormuzd Rassam in 1853, describes a flood that wipes out everything, except what's preserved by divine instruction. The survivors are told to bury certain objects and texts. So maybe what's hidden beneath Nippur isn't just paperwork. Maybe it's a time capsule, one meant to stay sealed until the world is ready. Reality check. Skeptics argue that buried tablets are just the result of collapsed buildings and ancient recycling, not secret vaults. But the selective burial of certain texts and the ritual layers found at Nippur don't fit that pattern. So here's the question. If the Sumerians really left a message in the subsoil, what did they want us to find, and what did they hope would never understand? Let's zoom in on the strangest artifact of all, the Sumerian king list. It's not just a list of names. It's a timeline, etched into a 20-centimeter clay prism known as the Weld-Blundell prism, and dated to around 1800 BCE. It claims to record every king from the dawn of time, stretching back before the flood. But here's the catch. The first 8 kings supposedly ruled for 241,200 years. That's not a type. Those numbers are right there, written in cuneiform. using the Sumerian sexagesimal math. After the flood, suddenly, kings live normal lifespans. The shift is instant. So why would a civilization famous for precise accounting suddenly drop impossible numbers into their official history? Mainstream scholars say it's all myth. The huge rains are just a way to show the king's divine status, not a literal calendar. The flood marks the end of the gods' direct rule and the start of real human history. Except the text doesn't say these numbers are symbolic. It just presents them as fact, then draws a hard line after the flood, almost like someone wanted to separate two totally different kinds of knowledge. That's the anomaly. Some researchers argue the antediluvian rains encode lost knowledge, maybe astronomical cycles, or a forgotten system of time. Others think the numbers hint at a cosmic event that reset everything. But here's the credibility anchor. The Weld-Blundell prism isn't a rumor. It's on display at the Ashmolean Museum, catalogued as WB444. Every expert agrees the text is real, even if nobody agrees what it means. Reality check. The strongest objection is that these numbers are just storytelling, not science. But if they're just stories, why the abrupt, systematic change right after the flood? Why not blend myth and history, like every other ancient list? So what was really lost in that flood? Just a few old kings, or an entire way of understanding the world? And here's the next puzzle. If the Sumerians coded their secrets in clay, what else did they leave behind that we still haven't cracked? So, if the flood drew a line in Sumerian history, what's hiding in the numbers on the other side? Most people glance at those king lists and see fantasy. Who could rule for 28,800 years? Who even counts that high? But here's the thing. The Sumerians didn't use our base 10 math. They worked in base 60. Sexagesimal. Every reign, every measurement, every sacred number was filtered through this system. Mainstream scholars say these reigns are divine exaggerations. The idea is that impossibly long lifespans signal the king's godlike status, not their actual birthdays. The flood, they say, marks the transition from mythic time to real human time. Except the numbers aren't random. They're neat multiples, rounded, patterned, and mathematically precise. The king list doesn't just make things up. It encodes the reigns using the same math as temple dimensions and star chart. So maybe these numbers aren't about years at all. Some researchers think the reigns might be coded references, maybe astronomical cycles or lost units of time. Others suggest the numbers represent a forgotten system of knowledge, only understandable if you know the code. Now, here's a credibility anchor. The Weld-Blundell prism, where all this is written, isn't some fringe artifact. It's catalogued, studied, and on display at the Ashmolean Museum. Every Sumerologist has seen these numbers and debated what they mean. But the mainstream still insists these are just symbols, not data. Reality check. The strongest objection is that ancient cultures always exaggerated the past to make it seem golden and unreachable. That's true. But the Sumerians' obsession with precision everywhere else makes these exaggerations stand out. So, what if the king list is a cipher, not a fairy tale? And if that's the case, what other messages are hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to break the code? But let's dig deeper, literally. If the king list is a cipher, then what about the raw material of creation itself? Why is the origin story so obsessed with forbidden clay? Here's the thing. The Enki and Ninmah myth doesn't just say humans are made from earth. It says the clay comes from the Abzu, a realm sealed off from mortals, and even most gods. The text repeats this detail like a warning label. Mainstream scholars call the Abzu a metaphor, just the Sumerian way of talking about groundwater or the underworld. In this view, divine clay is just a poetic way to say special dirt taught. The real message is about humans being shaped from the earth, nothing more. Except the Abzu isn't just any underworld. It's a cosmic vault, a domain of hidden waters and raw creative power. The myth is clear. Only Enki, the god of wisdom, has access. Everyone else is locked out. So why make the origin of humanity depend on something so inaccessible? Some researchers suggest this isn't a metaphor at all. Maybe the Abzu represents a lost technology or source of life. Something the Sumerians believed was real, but sealed off after a cosmic event. Now, here's a credibility anchor. The Enki and Ninmah myth is part of the official Sumerian canon, found on tablets from Nippur and Ur, excavated by teams like the University of Pennsylvania in the late 19th century. The language is deliberate. This isn't a mistranslation or a later embellishment, but reality check. The strongest objection is that there's no evidence for a real forbidden clay or any advanced knowledge hidden in these myths. That's fair, but then why stress the Abzu's inaccessibility? And why keep returning to the idea of sealed knowledge? So, what was the Sumerians' real fear? Was the Abzu clay just a symbol, or a warning about tampering with the source code of life? And if the key ingredient is locked away, what happens if someone finds the door? Now, here's where things get stranger. The Sumerians didn't just invent humans. They invented the rules for being human. They called these rules divine ordinances, decreed by the gods, recorded on tablets, and handed down to kings and priests. Over 100 are listed in the texts. But these aren't just laws like don't steal or pay your taxes. Some are weirdly abstract: truth, fear, a troubled heart. Others are practical: craftsmanship, leadership, victory. So, what are these really? Mainstream scholars say they're the building blocks of civilization. The Sumerians were organizing their world, turning chaos into order. And these ordinances are just early attempts at social engineering. Except the list is all over the place. Why include fear and a troubled heart with skills like carpentry and kingship? Why are existential emotions treated as cosmic software, right alongside the basics of city life? That's the anomaly. Some researchers argue the me are more than rules. They're the operating system for reality. If you want to run a world, you need both the code for making bricks and the code for feeling anxiety. But here's the credibility anchor. The me lists come from real tablets, like those found at Nippur and Uruk, cataloged and translated by teams at the University of Pennsylvania and the British Museum. The same scribes who tracked barley shipments also copied these ordinances, word for word. So maybe the Sumerians saw the universe as programmable, A system with modules you could install, remove, or even hack. Reality check. The strongest objection is that the me are just mythic metaphors, not evidence of ancient code or cosmic engineering. That's fair. Except the Sumerians themselves drew no line between the emotional and the practical, the divine and the mundane. So if the me are the software and the Abzu clay is the hardware, what's missing from the system? And why does the list of ordinances never mention the knowledge of human origins? Was it lost, hidden, or simply too dangerous to share? Here's where the puzzle gets personal. The Sumerians didn't just document the rules of kings and craftsmen. They wrote down fear and a troubled heart as divine ordinances, not as side notes, but as core modules in the me, right alongside victory and truth. But why would a civilization obsessed with order and cosmic balance make anxiety and dread part of the official operating system? Mainstream thinking says it's simple. Ancient people were anxious about life, death, and the unknown. The gods just reflected human worries, so fear and trouble made the list. Except that doesn't really fit. The Sumerians treated these not as unfortunate side effects, but as foundational elements installed by the gods, not just suffered by humans. Fear isn't a glitch, it's a feature. So what's going on? One alternative is that these emotions weren't just psychological, they were engineered. If the me are the software, maybe the gods built existential dread into the code on purpose, not to punish, but to control. Here's a credibility anchor. The me lists are documented on real tablets, like those from Nippur, with fear and troubled heart included right between practical skills. These aren't later additions, they're core to the original canon. But then comes the anomaly. If the Sumerians could catalog the building blocks of civilization, why not include the knowledge of human origins? Why make fear official, but origins taboo? Reality check. The strongest objection is that ancient texts should be read like technical manuals. Myths are just stories, not blueprints. Fair point. But the Sumerians' obsession with cataloging everything else makes this omission stick out even more. So maybe the Sumerians feared existence because they sensed something was missing, some knowledge deliberately withheld. And if fear itself was installed by design, what else might have been coded into humanity? And who decided what we're allowed to remember? But here's the real kicker. If fear was deliberately coded into the human experience, why is the actual knowledge of our origins missing from the me? Those divine ordinances that supposedly covered everything. You'd think the blueprint for humanity would be the headline, not the footnote. Except when you scan those ancient lists, origins is just gone, not erased, not argued over. Simply not there. So, what happened? Mainstream scholars say it's just mythic tradition. The gods keep certain mysteries to themselves, and the Sumerians accepted that some things were unknowable. The flood, they argue, marks the point where divine knowledge is sealed off, and humans are left to piece together the scrap. But that doesn't explain the precision everywhere else. The Sumerians cataloged everything, the me, the king lists, even the dimensions of temples, down to the last brick. Why go silent on the one thing every civilization obsesses over? Where we come from? Here's the anomaly. The texts are full of recipes for rituals, lists of powers, and even the emotional software of humanity. But the how of human creation is always just out of reach. hinted at, never spelled out. So maybe this wasn't an accident. Some researchers suggest the omission is intentional, a theological firewall. The gods, or maybe the priestly elite, deliberately withheld the knowledge of origins to keep humanity in check. If you don't know where you came from, you don't know what you're capable of. Now, this isn't just a theory pulled from thin air. The omission shows up in documented tablets from Nippur and Uruk, studied by real teams, University of Pennsylvania, British Museum, you name it. The absence is consistent, not a translation error or a lost fragment. Reality check. Critics argue that comparing Sumerian myth to modern programming is just reading too much into old stories. That's a fair point, but it doesn't explain why the origin question is the only thing systematically left out. So, what was so dangerous about origin knowledge that it had to be erased from the cosmic rulebook? And if the Sumerians were afraid of what we might remember, what else have we forgotten? By design. So, if the Sumerians were so careful to hide the origins of humanity, why did they leave the story of Inanna's descent wide open? Here's the thing. Inanna, goddess of love and war, doesn't just visit the underworld. She storms it. She strips away her power, her clothing, her me, layer by layer, until she stands naked before Ereshkigal, queen of the dead. But then it gets strange. Mainstream scholars say this is about submission. Inanna, facing death, learns humility. The myth is a warning. Even gods must bow to the ultimate law. Except the text doesn't quite fit that lesson. Inanna isn't dragged down. She chooses to descend. She brings her own me, her own rules, and even appoints a backup plan in case things go south. That's not submission. That's a calculated risk. So what's really happening? Some researchers see this as a coded message about access. Inanna isn't punished. She's initiated. The descent strips her memory, her divine status, maybe even her knowledge of origins. When she returns, she's changed, cut off from something she once possessed. It's not just a journey to death. It's a firewall, one that wipes the cosmic hard drive. Now, here's the credibility anchor. The Descent of Inanna is one of the oldest texts we have, found on tablets from Uruk and Nippur, and translated by scholars like Samuel Noah Kramer. The ritual stripping and the silence in the underworld are documented, not just interpreted. But reality check. The strongest objection is that there's no explicit mention of memory erasure or forbidden knowledge in the text. Only poetic metaphors. That's true. All. But the Sumerians never spelled out the big stuff directly. They encoded it in ritual and reversal. So was Inanna captured by death, or did she volunteer to forget? And if descent means losing access to the origins, what happens to the rest of us? Born into the world, already stripped of memory. Here's the twist. Inanna's descent isn't just a story about death. It's a map of the soul's journey. The Sumerians split the universe into 3 realms. Anu, a sky above, the middle world of the living, and Kar, the underworld. Each realm isn't just a place. It's a state of being. The underworld isn't evil, but it's not home either. It's a mirror, reflecting what's been lost, or maybe what's been hidden. But why a mirror? Mainstream scholars say Kur is where the dead go, ruled by Ereshkigal. And that's that. The descent is about learning limits, accepting mortality, and coming to terms with the human condition. Except the texts are obsessed with boundaries and reversals. Inanna passes through 7 gates, losing a piece of herself at each one. She's not just stripped of power. She's stripped of memory, identity, even her me. When she returns, she's not the same. The underworld doesn't just hold the dead. It erases the past. So maybe Kur isn't punishment. Maybe it's a reset button. Some researchers think the Sumerians saw birth and death as parallel descents, just as Inanna forgets her power. Maybe every soul forgets its origins when entering the world. The underworld is a mirror, because it reflects what we can't remember, not what we've done. Here's the credibility anchor. The Sumerian cosmological map. Sky, earth, underworld is documented in tablets from Nippur and and the ritual stripping is described in detail in the oldest versions of Inanna's myth. But reality check. The biggest objection is that there's no explicit passage about souls losing divine memory at birth. That's true. The text doesn't spell it out, but the structure is there. Descent, loss, return, changed forever. So, what if the underworld's real function is to block access to origin knowledge on purpose? And if that's true, what did the Sumerians believe happens to the soul when it tries to look back through the mirror? Here's the puzzle. If the Sumerians were obsessed with boundaries and forgetting, why don't their texts ever spell out the moment the soul loses its memory? You'd expect at least one tablet to describe the soul's passage. What gets stripped, what's left behind, and why. But no such text exists. The cuneiform record is silent on the mechanics of forgetting. That's not an accident. Mainstream scholars argue that the Sumerians just weren't interested in that kind of detail. The myths, they say, are about ritual and cosmic order, not psychological states or metaphysical mechanics. But that doesn't quite fit. These are the same scribes who detailed the number of bricks in a ziggurat and the exact dimensions of the cosmos. They cataloged everything, except the one thing that would explain why humans don't remember their origins. So, what gives? One possibility. The process of soul stripping was considered too sacred, or too dangerous, to write down. Maybe only the highest priests or initiates were allowed to know, and even then, only through oral tradition or ritual, never inked in clay. Except there's a deeper layer. Some researchers point to structural parallels with other ancient traditions. In Plato's philosophy, learning is recollection, a recovery of forgotten knowledge. The Sumerians never say this outright, but the pattern is there. Descent, loss, return, changed forever. Now, here's a credibility anchor. The absence is documented. Scholars like Samuel Noah Kramer have pored over thousands of tablets from Nippur, Uruk, and The silence on soul stripping isn't a gap in translation. It's a consistent feature of the surviving texts. Reality check. Critics say comparing Sumerian myth to Greek philosophy is a stretch. That's true. Similar patterns don't prove a shared origin. But the structural echo is hard to ignore, especially when the Sumerians were so meticulous elsewhere. So, was the missing memory a deliberate blind spot, enforced by ritual silence? And if the Sumerians hid the mechanics of forgetting, what else did they leave out? On purpose? Here's where the story takes a sharp turn, straight into the heart of the flood. Most people know the Epic of Gilgamesh as the world's oldest adventure tale, but buried in its clay tablets is something stranger. A flood story that sounds suspiciously like a technical report. The British Museum's flood tablet, GAC 3375, dug up by Hormuzd Strassam in 1853, doesn't just recount a myth. It details measurements, materials, and step-by-step instructions for survival. Utnapishtim, the Sumerian Noah, gets a list. Build a boat, seal it with pitch, load it with the seed of all living things. But here's the thing. The prologue frames the story as a recovered account from before the flood, a relic of antediluvian knowledge. This isn't just a fable about divine wrath. It's a transmission from a lost world. Mainstream scholars say the flood is symbolic. A mythic rupture separating the age of gods from the age of men. The technical bits? Just narrative flair, not a real blueprint. Except the details don't stop at boat building. The story catalogs what's preserved and what's lost. Some things are saved by explicit instruction. Others vanish forever. The implication: not everything was meant to survive. So what if the flood isn't just a story, but a protocol for a reset? Some researchers argue the narrative is a coded manual, preserving the essentials, erasing the rest. The flood becomes a firewall, not just a disaster. Now, here's a credibility anchor. The flood tablet is real, on display in London, and its parallels with Genesis aren't just literary, they're structural. Both stories obsess over what gets carried forward and what's deliberately left behind. Reality check. The strongest objection is that these parallels are just coincidence. Ancient cultures loved flood stories. That's fair, but the Sumerian versions focus on what knowledge survives, and how is unusually specific. So, was the flood a cosmic accident or a controlled memory wipe? And if the survivors followed a blueprint, what secrets were they told to bury for good? Here's the odd part. Gilgamesh doesn't start with the flood. It opens with a puzzle. An ancient city, a king who knew the ways, and knowledge from a world that no longer exists. But why begin with a lost world instead of the hero's journey? The prologue claims Gilgamesh saw the deep, learned secrets, and brought back wisdom from before the flood. It's not just bragging. It's a frame. Everything that follows is filtered through the lens of lost knowledge. Except the epic doesn't spell out what that knowledge is. It hints at blueprints, lists, and hidden tablets. Gilgamesh is told to read the copper box, to seek the foundation stone, to look for something buried beneath the city walls. So, is this just mythic window dressing, or a clue? Mainstream scholars say the prologue is a literary device. It sets up Gilgamesh as a seeker, someone who bridges the gap between gods and mortals. The lost world is just a backdrop for the quest, but the anomalies stack up. The story isn't about immortality. It's about recovering what was lost in the flood. Gilgamesh's journey is framed as a search for antediluvian knowledge, not just eternal life. The plant he finds at the end isn't just a symbol of youth. It's a relic from the world before the reset. So maybe the epic isn't just a story. It's a map. Now, here's the credibility anchor. The earliest tablets of Gilgamesh, from the library of Ashurbanipal and sites like Nineveh and Uruk. I'll start with this prologue. The structure is deliberate, not a later addition. Reality check. Critics argue that ancient epics always use lost worlds to raise the stakes. That's true. But Gilgamesh's focus on what's buried, not just what's gone, is unique. So, what was the Sumerian obsession with the before times? And if the real treasure was antediluvian knowledge, what did the flood really erase? Just people, or the very memory of how things began? So, Gilgamesh goes to the ends of the earth, survives the flood story, and finds a plant. Not a crown, not a weapon, but something that promises to restore youth. But here's the catch. He doesn't get to keep it. Just as he's about to return home, a snake steals the plant and slithers away. The text is clear. The plant is gone, and with it, the last link to the antediluvian world. Why make the climax of the world's oldest epic hinge on a stolen plant? Mainstream scholars say the plant is just a symbol. Youth, rebirth, the cycle of life. Gilgamesh's loss teaches him to accept mortality. The snake is just a plot device, nothing more. Except the story doesn't treat it like an ordinary plant. The plant is described as hidden at the bottom of the cosmic sea, guarded, almost forbidden. Gilgamesh retrieves it by diving to the depths, mirroring the Sumerian obsession with sealed knowledge and unreachable realms. So maybe the plant isn't just about living longer. Some researchers propose the plant is a stand-in for access, a cosmic boundary marker. The theft by the snake isn't just bad luck. It's a reset of the rules. Humanity gets a glimpse of the old world, then the door slams shut again. Here's the credibility anchor. The oldest versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh, including the tablets from Nineveh and the old Babylonian fragments, all feature the plant episode. It's not a late addition or a mistranslation. The paradox is built in from the start. Reality check. The strongest objection is that ancient stories always use lost treasures to symbolize missed opportunities. That's fair. But the Sumerian focus on what's hidden, sealed, or stolen goes deeper than moral lesson. So why does the epic frame the plant's loss as a cosmic event, not just a personal tragedy? And if the plant marks the boundary between worlds, what's really being protected? And who set the rule? Here's where the numbers start to look suspicious. The Sumerian king list isn't shy about big claims. 8 antediluvian kings, ruling for a combined 241 to 200 years. Then suddenly, after the flood, reigns dropped to human scale. No slow fade, just a hard reset. But what are these numbers really saying? Mainstream scholars say they're not literal. The reigns are written in sexagesimal, base 60 math, which was the Sumerians' way of signaling divine stat. The flood is the dividing line. Before, kings are gods. After, kings are men. Except the math is too neat. The numbers aren't random. They're multiples of 3,600 and 36,000. Numbers that show up in Sumerian astronomy and temple design. It's almost like the reigns are codes, not calendars. So what if the king list is a symbolic record, not a historical one? Some researchers argue these numbers encode cycles, cosmic ages, or lost knowledge about time itself. Maybe the Sumerians were tracking something bigger than politics. The rhythm of the heavens, the rise and fall of worlds. Here's the credibility anchor. The Weld-Blundell prism, catalogued as WB 444 and dated to around 1800 BCE, is the real deal. It's been studied by every major Sumerologist. The numbers are right there, etched in clay, not a mistranslation or a myth. But there's a catch. Reality check. The strongest objection is that ancient cultures always exaggerate the past to make it seem golden and unreachable. That's true, but the Sumerians were obsessed with precision everywhere else. Why fudge the numbers here? So, are these numbers a code for something we've missed? And if the king list is a cipher, what else did the Sumerians hide in plain sight, waiting for someone to crack it? Here's the weird part. The king list numbers don't just shrink, they nosedive. Before the flood, kings rule for tens of thousands of years. After? No. They're lucky to make it past 100. There's no gradual decline, no transition period. It's like someone flipped a switch. Mainstream scholars say the flood marks a mythic divide. The gods withdraw, the world resets, and human kingship begins. The long reigns are just a way to show how different the old world was. Untouchable, golden, unreachable. But the collapse is too sharp. Oh, one day you're a god king with a 36,000-year reign. The next, you're just a mortal, stuck with a human lifespan and all the limits that come with it. The text doesn't explain why, just that it happened instantly. So, what triggered the drop? Some researchers argue the flood wasn't just a physical disaster. It was a knowledge event. The old rulers had access to something. A technology, a cosmic principle, or even a lost calendar system that let them stretch time. When the flood hit, that access was cut off. Except the king list doesn't say the knowledge was destroyed. It says it was withheld. That's a big difference. Here's the credibility anchor. The Sumerian king list, especially the Weld-Blundell prism, is a real artifact, catalogued and studied for over a century. The reigns are listed in clear, deliberate script. No ambiguity, no sign of later editing. But why bother encoding this collapse in such precise numbers if it's just a story? Reality check. The strongest objection is that these reigns are pure myth, meant to glorify the past and make the present seem ordinary. That's valid. But then, why not taper the numbers gradually? Why the sudden cliff? So, did the flood erase more than just cities? Did it seal away a whole system of power? And if the knowledge wasn't lost but locked, is there any way back through that door? So, if the flood slammed the door on ancient knowledge, what traces did it leave behind? Here's the thing. The Sumerians didn't just write about a giant flood. They built their entire worldview around what came after. The flood wasn't just destruction. It was a reset. But the texts are obsessed with what didn't make it through. The Epic of Gilgamesh spells it out. After the flood, the world changes. Lifespans shrink, kingship shifts, and the me, the divine ordinances, are suddenly incomplete. Some are handed down, but others vanish, never to be seen again. It's not just about survival. It's about what gets preserved and what gets sealed away. Mainstream scholars say this is all symbolic. The flood marks the end of a mythic era and the start of history. Divine knowledge isn't really lost. It's just the gods pulling back, letting humans figure things out on their own. Except the texts don't describe a gentle transition. They describe a rupture. The king list draws a hard line. The flood isn't just a disaster. It's the moment when access to the old world is cut off. The me lists after the flood are shorter, missing pieces that were supposedly foundational before. So maybe the flood didn't just erase cities. Maybe it locked away the recipe for civilization itself. Some researchers think the flood story is a coded memory of a knowledge lockdown. The survivors didn't just rebuild, they started over, with only fragments of what came before. But there's a fact we can't ignore. The woolly flood layer at Ur is real, a thick band of water-laid clay, separating two different worlds in the archaeological record. Excavated by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, is a physical marker of a break between eras. Reality check. Critics argue the woolly flood layer doesn't match the scale of the myth, and the idea of sealed knowledge is just reading too much into old stories. Fair enough. But the Sumerians themselves insisted something fundamental was lost, a claim that shows up in text after text. So, if the flood was a firewall, what knowledge got left on the other side? And is there any trace of it left for us to find? Or did the Sumerians bury the key for good? Here's the real mystery. After the flood, the Sumerians didn't just start over with blank slates. They built a canon. But was it a survival kit or a set of bedtime stories? The Sumerian scribal canon is a greatest hits list. The Hymn to Enlil, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the King List, and more. These weren't random tales. They were curated, copied, and drilled into generations of scribes at the Ajaba, the tablet school. But here's the thing. The canon doesn't just preserve myths. It catalogs processes, rituals, and specifications, sometimes down to the last brick or barley measure. The same hands that wrote about gods also wrote about irrigation and accounting. So mainstream theory says the canon is mythology with a side of politics. The stories encode the anxieties of a city-state civilization. Floods, kingship, cosmic order. The Ajaba wasn't inventing new knowledge, just passing down what the elite wanted remembered. Except there's an anomaly. The knowledge hierarchy in these texts doesn't map to morality or law. It maps to cosmology. Access isn't about being good. It's about fitting into the cosmic system. The me, the king list, the rituals, they're all structured like a flowchart, not a sermon. So what if these weren't just stories? Some researchers argue the canon is a set of instructions, not allegory, not therapy, but a literal operating manual for civilization. One that only makes sense if you know the code. Now, here's the credibility anchor. The canon is documented. Excavations at Nippur, Uruk, and Ur have turned up thousands of tablets, many with duplicate texts and even curriculum lists for scribal students. The system was real, not a modern invention. But here's the reality check. Critics say the canon structure is just the result of bureaucratic tradition, not evidence of hidden instructions. That's a strong point. But then why the obsession with cosmic fit? And why the gaps where the most fundamental knowledge should be? So, was the Sumerian canon a user's manual for a lost system? Or just a collection of cautionary tales? And if it was a manual, what happens when you try to run the code with half the instructions missing? Here's where it gets tricky. What exactly was the Ajaba, the Sumerian scribal school? Most people picture a library. Neat rows of tablets, students copying lines, teachers barking out grammar drills. A place to memorize and recite, not to invent. But the reality on the ground was messier. Ajaba tablets weren't just textbooks. They included riddles, strange lexical lists, and exercises that looked more like puzzles than lessons. Some even contained forbidden words, or cryptic references to lost rituals. So, was the Ajaba just a training ground for bureaucrats? Or something deeper? Mainstream scholars say it was all about transmission. The school's job was to preserve the canon, not question it. Students learned by rote, copying the same stories and formulas their teachers had learned before them. Except there are anomalies. Some tablets show deliberate errors, lines that don't match the standard version, or odd insertions that look like coded messages. Others contain lists of me, cosmological diagrams, or instructions for rituals that don't appear anywhere else. That's not just memorization. It's almost as if the Ajaba was a labyrinth, one where the real knowledge was hidden behind layers of misdirection and code. Now, here's the credibility anchor. Archaeologists at Nippur and Ur have found entire tablet rooms, with curriculum lists and student exercises stacked alongside the canonical texts. Some of these exercises are unique, found nowhere else in the Sumerian world. So, maybe the Ajaba wasn't just a school. Maybe it was a filter, a place where only those who could crack the code got access to the real system. But reality check. The strongest objection is that these anomalies are just mistakes or local variations, not evidence of secret knowledge. That's a fair point. Scribal errors happened everywhere, but the pattern of deliberate deviation, especially in the context of a culture obsessed with precision, is hard to ignore. So, was the Ajaba a library, a labyrinth, or both? And if the real secrets were hidden in plain sight, what did you have to lose or forget to find your way through? Here's the twist. In Sumer, not everyone could access every secret, even if you could read. The Ajaba wasn't just a school. It was a sorting machine. Students copied the same lines, but only a few advanced to the next layer. The rest stayed stuck, repeating the basic. But why? Mainstream historians say it's just social hierarchy. The elite controlled knowledge, so only trusted scribes got the full set of stories and ritual. That's how you keep power in the family. Except the Sumerian curriculum wasn't built around morality, loyalty, or even intelligence. It was built around cosmology, the me, the king lists, the hymns. They don't organize people by virtue or rank. They organize them by fit. Who belongs where in the cosmic system? Who can hold certain knowledge without breaking the order? So, access wasn't just about privilege. It was about compatibility. If you didn't fit the pattern, you didn't get the next piece of the puzzle. Some researchers think this wasn't just an educational method. It was a security protocol. The texts themselves only made sense if you were wired the right way. If not, the deeper layers stayed hidden, even if you could recite every word. Now here's the credibility anchor. Tablets from Nippur and Uruk show students progressing through increasingly complex texts, but only the top tier ever copied the cosmological diagrams or the lists of me. Curriculum was real. The filtering was deliberate. But reality check. Critics argue this is just meritocracy. Advanced students get harder assignments. Nothing mystical about it. That's fair. Except the Sumerians themselves describe knowledge as something you hold or bear, not just something you memorize. So, was the Sumerian canon a cosmic sorting hat, measuring not just what you knew, but what you could handle? And if the curriculum was a map of the universe, what happened to those who reached the end and found the last piece missing? Here's where things get uncomfortable. If the Sumerian canon was a cosmic sorting system, who built it? And why leave the last piece out? That brings us back to Enki, the god who always seems to be one step ahead of everyone else. He's the architect of humanity, the trickster who slips forbidden knowledge past the other gods, the fixer who patches up creation when it starts to break down. But here's the thing. The myths don't agree on whether Enki's work is a master plan or a series of hacks. Sometimes he's the designer, laying out the blueprints for the universe. Other times he's the repairman, called in to fix what the other gods can't handle. So which is it? Mainstream scholars say Enki represents the Sumerians' respect for wisdom and cunning. He's not a literal engineer. He's a symbol of problem solving, the god you pray to when things go sideways. Except the texts are loaded with technical language. Enki doesn't just wave his hand and make things better. He gives instructions, issues specifications, and even lists the tools needed for each fix. When humanity's first models fail, Enki tweaks the design, adjusting limbs, senses, even the emotional software. It's not just myth, it's iteration. Some researchers see this as a clue. Maybe the Sumerians didn't see creation as a one-and-done miracle, but as a process. One that could be upgraded, patched, or even sabotaged. But then, why leave the origin code out of the curriculum? Was it too dangerous, too unstable, or just unfinished? Here's a credibility anchor. The Enki and Ninmah myth, documented on tablets from Nippur and describes these design meetings in detail. The language is procedural, almost like a project log. Reality check. Critics argue this is just allegory. Creation stories always double as lessons in humility and adaptation. Fair enough, but the Sumerians' obsession with process and their silence on the final step suggests they saw a real gap. So was Enki's intervention a master plan, or just a workaround for a system nobody fully controlled? And if the last piece was left out on purpose, what was the risk of putting it back in? Here's the catch. If Enki's workaround left something out, what was the original point of humanity in the first place? The Atrahasis epic doesn't open with a noble mission or a cosmic calling. It starts with a crisis. The lesser gods are exhausted, forced to dig canals and do manual labor for eternity. They revolt. So, the solution isn't enlightenment. It's outsourcing. The gods create humans to take over the grunt work. Enki steps in, offers the recipe, and humanity is born, not as partners, but as a workforce. That's the mainstream view. Humans are made to serve the gods, maintain temples, and keep the cosmic machinery running. The myth is about balance. Humans exist to relieve divine suffering, not to seek their own purpose. Except the story doesn't end there. The new system goes haywire. Humans multiply, make too much noise, and threaten the gods' peace. The solution: plagues, famine, and finally, the flood. Enki bends the rules again, warning Atrahasis and saving a remnant. But here's the twist. If humans were just tools, why bother saving any at all? Why risk divine anger to preserve a flawed creation? Some researchers argue the Atrahasis story is a paradox. Humanity is both a fix and a problem, created to solve one crisis, then nearly wiped out for causing another. Maybe Enki's plan was never about obedience, but about testing the limits of the system. Now, here's the credibility anchor. The Atrahasis tablets, excavated from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh and dated to the 17th century BCE, lay out this cycle in detail. The story isn't a fringe variant. It's a core part of the Mesopotamian canon. Reality check. Critics say the cycle of creation, rebellion, and flood is just a reflection of ancient anxieties. Nothing more than a cautionary tale about hubris and limits. Fair enough. But the technical language and repeated system resets suggest the Sumerians saw deeper patterns at work. So, if humanity was created as a workaround, what was the real risk in restoring the missing piece? And if Enki's intervention was a patch, not a plan, what happens when the next crisis hits? Here's the strange part. If Enki's patch was just a quick fix, why does every Sumerian myth circle back to the same blind spot, forgetting where we came from? Most ancient stories obsess over origins. But Sumerian texts? They dance around it. The clay is from the Abzu, but nobody says how it's shaped. The Me list catalogs everything from victory to fear, but skips the knowledge of beginning. Even in the king list, the numbers before the flood are huge, but the how and why are always missing. So, what's going on? Mainstream scholars say it's just the nature of myth. The gods keep some secrets for themselves, and humans aren't supposed to know everything. The flood is the line. Before, knowledge was open. After, it's sealed. Except the pattern is too consistent. It's not just one missing detail. It's a system-wide blind spot. Every myth, every tablet, every ritual. The moment of origin is always out of focus. So maybe this isn't just a literary gap. Some researchers propose the Sumerians believed in a kind of birth amnesia, a cosmic firewall that wipes memory at the moment of creation. Not just for mortals, but even for gods who descend into the underworld. The descent of Inanna, the silence in Kur, the missing me, all hint at a deliberate forgetting. But here's the anchor. This isn't just speculation. The structure shows up in documented texts from Nippur, Uruk, and Ur, across genres and centuries. The omission is systematic, not accidental. Now, reality check. The biggest objection is that there's no direct passage in cuneiform saying the soul forgets at birth. That's true. The argument is structural, not explicit. But the recurring silence, especially in a culture obsessed with lists and records, is hard to write off as coincidence. So, was this forgetting a safety feature installed to keep humanity from reclaiming dangerous knowledge? And if so, what would it take to break through the firewall and remember what was lost? But what if the Sumerian firewall isn't just an ancient quirk? What if it's the same blind spot that pops up in Plato, thousands of years later and hundreds of miles away? Here's the thing. Plato's most famous theory isn't about politics or Atlantis. It's about memory. He claimed that learning is really just remembering, anamnesis. According to Plato, every soul forgets everything at birth, and life is just a slow process of recollection. But that's not a Sumerian idea, right? Except the structure matches. In both cases, the moment of origin is a blackout. The soul enters the world, but the memory of where it came from, gone. The Sumerians never spell it out, but their myths always circle the missing piece. Plato just says it out loud. So is this parallel a coincidence or a clue? Some researchers think these two traditions are tapping into the same intuition. Maybe the ancients sensed that forgetting wasn't a flaw, but a feature. A way to keep dangerous knowledge locked up, only accessible to those who could handle it. But then, What's the risk? If remembering is so powerful, why treat it like a curse? Plato warns that too much recollection can destabilize society. The Sumerians hint that reclaiming forbidden knowledge could break the cosmic order. Here's the credibility anchor. Plato's theory comes from the Meno and the Phaedo, two of his most analyzed dialogues. The Sumerian pattern is documented in tablets from Nippur, Uruk, and Ur, studied by experts like Samuel Noah Cromer. Reality check. The strongest objection is that comparing Sumerian myth to Greek philosophy is a stretch. Different cultures, different goals. That's valid, but the structural echo is there, and neither tradition treats memory loss as a simple accident. So, is memory a gift, something to be reclaimed at all costs? Or is it a curse, installed to keep us from opening doors we can't close? And if someone ever did break through that firewall, would they find wisdom, or something far more dangerous? So why do civilizations separated by centuries and continents keep running into the same wall? You'd expect Sumerian myths and Greek philosophy to be totally different beasts. Different languages, different gods, different obsessions. But again and again, both traditions circle the same missing piece. The moment of origin, the memory of before. That's not just a coincidence. Plato calls it anamnesis, a soul forced to forget, then clawing its way back to truth through flashes of memory. The Sumerians never say it directly, but their myths are built around sealed realms, forbidden knowledge, and the cosmic price of looking back. But here's the thing. Both systems treat forgetting as a boundary, not a bug. The rules are enforced by gods, fate, or the very structure of the universe. Try to cross that line, and you risk more than confusion. You risk destabilizing the whole system. So what's really going on? Mainstream scholars chalk it up to universal human anxiety. Every culture wonders where we come from and why we can't remember. The stories just reflect that itch, except the parallels run deeper than simple curiosity. Both traditions use the same structural moves, a cosmic event that resets the world, a ritual or journey that strips memory, and a warning about what happens if you push too far. It's not just about origins, it's about the cost of knowing. Some researchers think this is evidence of a shared intuition, maybe even a lost common source. Others argue it's just convergent evolution, different cultures stumbling onto the same puzzle because the human mind is wired that way. But there's a credibility anchor. The Sumerian flood story and Plato's dialogues are both documented, widely studied, and foundational to their culture. Pattern isn't cherry-picked, it's baked into the canon. Reality check. The strongest objection is that structural similarities don't prove direct influence or a real firewall. That's true, but the consistency, especially in cultures obsessed with cataloging and codifying, is hard to dismiss as random. So, are these structural mirrors pointing to a real mechanism, something built into consciousness itself? Or are they warning signs left by civilizations who learned the hard way that some doors are better left unopened? So here's the crossroads. Are Sumerian and Greek texts just creative storytelling? Or are they coded reports from people who saw something real? Most scholars say myth is myth. The Sumerians weren't writing history. They were working out their anxieties, encoding social rules, and explaining the world with big, memorable stories. The gods the floods, the forbidden knowledge, all allegories for things like political upheaval, the unpredictability of nature, or the mysteries of death. But then you hit the anomalies. Why do these texts get so technical? Why do they list measurements, materials, and step-by-step instructions, like the flood tablet specs for the Ark, or the ME's catalog of existential software? Why does the king list use precise sexagesimal numbers instead of vague, long-ago language? It's a weird pattern. Some researchers argue these aren't just stories. They're records, compressed, encrypted, but grounded in real events or lost technologies. The mythic language is camouflage, hiding details that only make sense if you know the code. But if that's true, then what's the code? Now, here's the credibility anchor. The Weld Blundell Prism, the Flood Tablet K3375. The Me lists from Nippur. These are all real, excavated artifacts. They're not medieval forgeries or later inventions. Their language is deliberate, their structure methodical. So the debate splits. Are we reading ancient manuals or just projecting our own curiosity onto old clay? Reality check. The strongest mainstream objection is that ancient people simply didn't think like us. Myth was their science, their psychology, their politics. That's fair. But the Sumerians' obsession with cataloging, measuring, and specifying stands out even among ancient culture. If it's all allegory, why the relentless precision? So if these texts are records, what exactly are they documenting? And if they're allegories, why do they keep circling the same missing piece? Then comes the bigger question. If there's a code, has anyone ever cracked it? Or is the real message still locked in the clay, waiting for someone with the right key? So here's the riddle. If the Sumerians were just telling stories, why do their texts obsess over what's missing, not just what's told? Over and over, the same pattern repeats. The creation myths spell out steps until the crucial moment, then go silent. The king list counts every year until the flood, then resets. The Me lists catalog everything from victory to fear, but skip the knowledge of origins. It's like there's a deliberate gap. But was something truly lost? Or was it locked away on purpose? Mainstream scholars say it's simple. Knowledge fades with time. Oral traditions break, tablets shatter, memories get fuzzy. The missing pieces are just casualties of history, not a cosmic cover-up. Except the Sumerians weren't casual about record-keeping. They buried duplicates, curated canons, and even made lists of lists. They were obsessed with preserving, not forgetting. So why the strategic silences? Some researchers think the omissions aren't accidents. They argue the Sumerian elite deliberately withheld the most dangerous knowledge, sealing it behind rituals, metaphors, and coded language. Not lost, but locked, with the key handed only to those who fit the cosmic pattern. Here's the credibility anchor. Archaeologists have found sealed tablet caches at Nippur and some deliberately hidden beneath temple floors. The most sensitive texts, cosmological diagrams, Me lists, king lists, are often found in these secret archives, not public libraries. But then comes the anomaly. If the knowledge was just lost, why do the texts keep circling the same missing moment, never naming it, but never letting it go? Reality check. The strongest objection is that we're just seeing patterns, because we want to projecting modern ideas of secrecy onto ancient minds. Well, that's fair. But the Sumerians themselves wrote about sealed knowledge and forbidden tablets. The concept isn't modern, it's theirs. So, was the knowledge of origins destroyed by time? Or hidden by design? And if it's locked, is the key gone forever? Or is someone, somewhere, still holding it? But let's pull the thread further. If the Sumerians' knowledge was hidden, then what about the physical evidence? Is there any sign the flood really happened? Or is that just another myth? Now, here's where things get muddy, literally. In the 1920s, Leonard Woolley excavated the ancient city of Ur. Deep beneath the city's ruins, he found a thick, clean layer of water-laid clay, sandwiched between two layers of human occupation. No pottery, no bones, just pure silt. It looked like proof. Mainstream scholars jumped on this woolly flood layer as the smoking gun. Here, finally, was evidence that a great flood really separated the old world from the new Awa. The Sumerian flood wasn't just a story. It was a memory of real disaster. But then, the cracks appeared. The layer wasn't uniform. Some sites had it, others didn't. At Ur, the clay was about 2 meters thick. But at nearby cities, like Kish and Shuruppak, the layer was thinner, or missing entirely. So, was it a local flood, or something bigger? Some researchers argue the flood was just a regional event, a river bursting its banks, not a world-ending cataclysm. Others point to the timing. The woolly layer dates to around 3000 BCE, but Sumerian king lists are much harder to pin down. Except the story won't go away. The Sumerians insisted the flood was the dividing line. After the clay, everything changes. Kingship, knowledge, even the way time is measured. Here's the credibility anchor. The woolly layer is real, documented in excavation reports and displayed in museum archives. It's not a rumor, it's a physical boundary. But reality check. The strongest objection is that the woolly layer doesn't match the scale or timing of the myth. That's valid, but the obsession with a rupture, both in the ground and in the texts, keeps the debate alive. So, is the woolly layer the scar left by a forgotten disaster, or just a geological coincidence Sumerians turned into legend? And if the flood was real, what else might be buried beneath that clay? Secrets that never made it back to the surface. But what if the flood wasn't just a disaster? What if it was a deliberate reset? Here's the thing. The Sumerians didn't treat the flood as just another bad year. It was the moment everything changed. Before kings ruled for thousands of years, knowledge flowed freely, and the gods walked among men. After, lifespans shrank, secrets vanished, and the world felt smaller, stripped of its cosmic access. That's not just a flood. That's a firewall. So, what if the flood was more than water? What if it was a cosmic event designed to seal off a previous era, to bury not just cities, but the very code of civilization? The texts hint at this over and over. The Epic of Gilgamesh isn't just about surviving a deluge. It's about losing access to something fundamental. Gilgamesh searches for antediluvian wisdom, not just immortality. The plant at the bottom of the sea, the hidden tablets, the lost me, all clues that something vital was locked away. But here's the anomaly. After the flood, the rules change instantly. No gradual decline, no memory of how things used to work. It's as if someone wiped the slate clean and installed new software. So maybe the flood was a cosmic firewall, an intentional rupture to protect the world from knowledge deemed too dangerous. Some researchers see this as a pattern. Floods, resets, and lost golden ages show up in myths from every continent. But the Sumerians are unique in how precise they are about what was lost and how deliberate the rupture feels. Now here's the credibility anchor. The flood story is documented on real tablets, like the British Museum's K335, and the physical woolly layer at Ur is there for anyone to see. The texts and the earth both insist on a dividing line. Reality check. The strongest objection is that floods are common, and ancient people just mythologized what they survived. That's fair, but the Sumerians' obsession with what's missing, knowledge, not just land, makes you wonder if they sensed a deeper loss. So, if the flood was a firewall, what was so dangerous that it had to be sealed away forever? And if that firewall ever fails, what might come rushing back into our world?